Imagine standing in the frozen wasteland of a broken city where the temperature drops so low that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Picture yourself surrounded by ruins that stretch endlessly in every direction, where buildings that once stood proud now look like the broken teeth of a dying giant. This is Stalingrad in the winter of 1943. And within these ruins, nearly 100,000 German soldiers are about to face a nightmare that will haunt history forever. These men, who once marched across Europe believing they were unstoppable, who believed their leader when he promised them glory and conquest, now stand shivering in the cold, defeated, broken, and terrified of what comes next. They have just surrendered to the Soviet Red Army after months of the most savage fighting the world has ever seen, and their ordeal is only beginning. What happened to these soldiers after they laid down their weapons is a story so horrifying, so brutal, and so tragic that it reveals the absolute worst of what human beings can do to each other. This is not just a story about war or politics or military strategy. This is a story about suffering on a scale almost impossible to imagine, about men who became walking skeletons, about the slow death march across frozen lands, about disease and starvation and despair that broke the strongest spirits. This is the entire story of the brutal fate of the German soldiers captured in Stalingrad, and it begins in the moment when their world came crashing down around them. The surrender did not come easily or quickly. For months, the German Sixth Army had been trapped inside Stalingrad, surrounded completely by Soviet forces who tightened their grip like a noose around a condemned man's neck. The German commander, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, had received orders directly from Adolf Hitler himself never to surrender, never to retreat, to fight until the last bullet and the last breath. Hitler had promised that supplies would come, that reinforcements would break through, that rescue was always just days away. But those promises were lies, and as January turned into February in 1943, the men of the Sixth Army knew that they had been abandoned. They had eaten their horses weeks ago. They had burned every piece of wood they could find to stay warm. They had watched their friends die from cold, from hunger, from wounds that could not be treated because there were no medicines left. When Paulus finally surrendered on February 2, 1943, defying Hitler's direct orders, he did so because there was simply nothing left to fight with and no reason to continue the slaughter. But surrender, as these men would soon learn, was not salvation. It was merely the beginning of a different kind of hell. When the shooting finally stopped and the German soldiers emerged from their hiding places in basements and bunkers and ruins, they looked like ghosts walking among the dead. The Soviet soldiers who took them prisoner could hardly believe what they were seeing. These were supposed to be the mighty warriors of the Wehrmacht, the fearsome army that had conquered most of Europe, the soldiers who had been described as superhuman fighters. Instead, what the Soviets saw were scarecrows dressed in filthy rags, men so thin that their bones showed through their skin, faces blackened by frostbite, eyes sunken deep into their skulls with a look of hopelessness that went beyond anything words could describe. Many of these German soldiers could barely walk. Some crawled on their hands and knees through the snow. Others simply sat down in the rubble and waited to die because they no longer had the strength or the will to move. The winter cold was so intense that it killed men within hours if they stopped moving, and many who survived the battle did not survive the first day of captivity simply because they could not keep walking. The Soviet soldiers who captured them had their own reasons to feel no mercy. These same German troops had invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941 with orders to destroy everything and everyone in their path. They had burned villages, executed civilians, starved entire cities, and treated the Russian people as less than human. The battle for Stalingrad itself had killed hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and civilians. The city that bore Stalin's name had been bombed and shelled until barely one building stood intact. The Soviets had lost sons and brothers and fathers and husbands in numbers that staggered the imagination. And now the men who had caused all this suffering were standing before them, defeated and helpless. Some Soviet soldiers showed pity. Many did not. The hatred ran too deep, the wounds too fresh, the desire for revenge too strong. And so began the long nightmare march that would kill most of these prisoners long before they ever saw Germany again. The Soviet plan was to move the captured German soldiers away from Stalingrad to prison camps deeper inside the Soviet Union. This sounds simple enough, but in practice it meant forcing nearly 100,000 starving, frozen, sick men to walk hundreds of miles through one of the coldest winters on record. The Soviets themselves were struggling to feed their own people and their own army. The war had devastated their country, destroyed their farms, killed millions of their civilians. They had no food to spare for prisoners, no medicine to treat their diseases, no warm clothing to replace the frozen rags the Germans wore. Even if the Soviets had wanted to treat these prisoners well, they lacked the resources to do so. But many Soviet guards did not want to treat them well. They wanted revenge, and the march became an opportunity to inflict suffering on the men who had brought so much suffering to their homeland. The prisoners were formed into long columns and told to start walking. Those who could not keep up were left behind, which meant they were left to die in the snow. The temperature often dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. Men who had no proper boots wrapped their feet in rags and newspapers, but frostbite ate away at their toes and fingers anyway. Within days, many prisoners were walking on feet that had turned black and dead, feeling nothing, but still forcing themselves forward, because stopping meant certain death. They received almost no food. Sometimes the guards gave them a piece of bread to share among 10 men. Sometimes they got thin soup made from water and a few scraps. Many times they got nothing at all. The hunger became so intense that men would eat anything they could find. They ate grass when they could find it under the snow. They ate bark from trees. They ate their leather belts and their boots when desperation overcame them completely. Some men, driven mad by hunger, turned to the unthinkable and ate the flesh of those who had died. Though this was rare, and those who did it were usually executed by the guards if they were caught. Disease spread through the columns like wildfire through dry wood. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and a dozen other illnesses attacked bodies that had no strength left to fight back. Men would be walking one moment and collapse the next, dead before they hit the ground. Others developed such severe diarrhea that they soiled themselves constantly, adding to their misery and humiliation. The smell of death and sickness hung over the marching columns like a cloud. Those who became too sick to walk were often shot by the guards rather than being left behind, though sometimes the guards did not waste bullets and simply left the dying men in the snow to freeze. The psychological torment matched the physical suffering. These men had been told their entire lives that they were members of a master race, that they were destined to rule over others, that they were superior beings. Now they were treated worse than animals, dying in filth and agony, completely powerless and utterly broken. After days or weeks of marching, depending on which route they took and which unit they belonged to, the survivors reached what the Soviets called collection camps. These were not really camps in any organized sense. They were usually just empty fields surrounded by barbed wire, or abandoned buildings with no heat or sanitation, or sometimes just areas marked out in the snow where the prisoners were told to stay. The conditions in these collection camps were nightmarish beyond description. Thousands of men were crowded into spaces meant for hundreds. There was no shelter from the cold. There were no toilets, so human waste piled up everywhere, spreading disease even faster. The prisoners slept on frozen ground, huddled together for warmth, waking up in the morning to find that the men beside them had died during the night. The death rate in these collection camps was staggering. Sometimes hundreds of men died in a single day in a single camp. Bodies were stacked like firewood outside the barbed wire because there was no way to bury them in the frozen ground and no energy to try. The living became so used to death that they stopped reacting to it. A man would die mid-sentence while talking to his friend, and the friend would simply move on to find someone else to talk to, knowing that his own turn would come soon enough. The Soviets made some efforts to organize the camps better as time went on, but in those first weeks and months after the surrender, chaos reigned and death was everywhere. Medical care was almost non-existent. A few German doctors who had been captured tried to help their fellow prisoners, but they had no supplies, no medicines, no bandages, no instruments. They could do nothing but watch as men died from infections that could have been easily treated under normal circumstances. Food remained scarce. The prisoners might get a small piece of bread every few days and some watery soup that had almost no nutritional value. The human body can survive for a surprisingly long time without food, but it cannot survive without hope, and hope was the rarest commodity in these camps. Men who had been strong and healthy just months before now weighed less than 90 pounds. Their muscles had wasted away. Their teeth fell out from scurvy. Their skin stretched tight over their bones like paper over a frame. They looked like the walking dead, and many of them were already dead inside, their spirits broken beyond repair. Some men went insane. They would scream and cry and tear at their own flesh. Others retreated into silence and simply stopped responding to the world around them, sitting motionless until they died. The will to live, which is normally so strong in human beings, began to flicker and fade in these camps as men realized that survival was unlikely, and that even if they did survive, the suffering might never end. Those who survived the collection camps faced yet another ordeal. The Soviets needed labor to work in their mines and factories and forests, and they decided that the German prisoners would provide that labor. This meant transporting tens of thousands of prisoners thousands of miles to the east, into Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. The transport itself killed thousands more. The prisoners were loaded into freight trains, packed so tightly into unheated boxcars that they could barely move. These trains traveled for weeks through the frozen landscape, stopping occasionally at stations where the guards would open the doors and remove the bodies of those who had died during the journey. Sometimes the train stopped in the middle of nowhere, and the prisoners were simply told to get out and start walking to wherever their final destination was supposed to be. Inside the boxcars, the conditions defied belief. There was no room to lie down, so the prisoners stood or sat pressed against each other for days on end. There was no toilet, so they relieved themselves where they stood, creating a floor of frozen waste. There was almost no ventilation, so the air became thick and poisonous. The cold was so intense that men froze to death standing up, and their bodies could not fall because there was no space for them to fall into. When the trains finally reached their destinations and the doors were opened, sometimes half the men inside were already dead. The survivors stumbled out into the Siberian winter, barely able to believe that conditions could get even worse, but knowing somehow that they probably would. The journey to Siberia broke men who had somehow survived everything else. The endless days in the boxcars, the lack of any information about where they were going or what would happen to them, the constant presence of death just inches away, the inability to move or stretch or exercise or do anything to help themselves. All of this combined to destroy whatever hope remained. Many prisoners died not from any specific illness or injury, but simply from giving up. They closed their eyes one night and never opened them again, their hearts stopping because their bodies had endured more than any human being should ever have to endure. Those who kept their eyes open and kept breathing did so through a combination of luck and a stubborn refusal to let death win. though many of them later said they did not know why they bothered to survive, when death would have been so much easier and so much less painful. The labor camps where the prisoners finally ended up varied in their conditions, but almost all of them were terrible. The camps were usually located in remote areas where the climate was harsh and escape was impossible. The prisoners were put to work in coal mines, in lumber camps, cutting down trees in frozen forests, in construction projects, building roads and railways, in factories, producing goods for the Soviet war effort. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. Men who had no strength left in their bodies were forced to swing axes and push wheelbarrows and carry heavy loads for 10 or 12 hours a day. Those who could not work were given even less food, which meant they became even weaker, which meant they could work even less, which meant they got even less food, in a downward spiral that ended in death. The guards in these camps ranged from relatively decent human beings who did their jobs without unnecessary cruelty to absolute monsters who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain and suffering on the prisoners. Some guards would beat prisoners for the smallest infractions or for no reason at all. Others would withhold food as punishment or make prisoners stand outside in the cold for hours as discipline. The prisoners had no rights and no way to appeal their treatment. They were completely at the mercy of whoever was guarding them at any given moment. Many guards were themselves Soviet citizens who had suffered terribly under German occupation and saw the prisoners as deserving of whatever happened to them. It is hard to blame these guards for their hatred, when their own families had been killed or starved by the German invasion. But their hatred nevertheless created an environment where mercy was rare and suffering was constant. Despite everything, some prisoners found ways to survive and even to maintain some shred of their humanity. They formed friendships with other prisoners, supporting each other through the worst times. They shared what little food they had. They told stories and sang songs to keep their spirits up. They celebrated Christmas and Easter in secret, holding on to their faith even when it seemed that God had abandoned them. They organized small acts of resistance, like deliberately working slowly or sabotaging equipment in tiny ways that the guards would not notice. These small acts of defiance gave them a sense of control in a situation where they had no control. And that sense of control sometimes made the difference between giving up and holding on. But for every man who found the strength to keep fighting, there were many others who simply could not go on. The death rate in the labor camps remained high for years after the war ended, and it would be a long time before the survivors would see home again. Hunger dominated every moment of every day for the German prisoners. No matter what else was happening, no matter whether they were working or resting or sleeping, the hunger was always there, gnawing at their bellies like a living thing. The Soviets provided food, but it was never enough. The daily ration might be a few hundred grams of bread and some thin soup, totaling maybe 800 or 1,000 calories, when a man doing heavy labor in freezing temperatures needs at least 3,000 calories just to maintain his weight. The result was slow starvation, a gradual wasting away of the body as it consumed itself to stay alive. The body burns fat first, then muscle, then starts breaking down organs to find the energy it needs to keep the heart beating and the lungs breathing. As the months and years passed, the prisoners became living skeletons. Their arms and legs became thin as sticks. Their stomachs swelled from malnutrition even as the rest of them shrank. Their skin developed sores that would not heal. Their hair fell out. Their teeth loosened and dropped from their gums. They became so weak that climbing a small hill left them gasping for breath. Simple tasks that would have taken minutes when they were healthy now took hours because they had to rest every few steps. The hunger affected their minds as much as their bodies. They thought about food constantly, dreaming about meals they had eaten in their past lives, planning elaborate menus of what they would eat when they finally got home, talking endlessly with other prisoners about recipes and restaurants and favorite dishes. Food became an obsession that pushed aside almost every other thought. Some prisoners became so desperate that they took terrible risks to get a little extra food. They would steal from each other, even though they knew that stealing was punishable by death or by having their already tiny rations reduced even further. They would volunteer for the most dangerous work assignments if those assignments came with a slightly larger bread ration. They would eat things that were not meant to be eaten, like potato peels from the garbage, or grass, or leaves, or anything that might contain even a trace of nutrition. Occasionally, a prisoner would manage to catch a rat or a bird, and this would be treated as a feast, with the meat divided among friends and eaten raw because there was no way to cook it. The constant hunger stripped away the social niceties and the civilized behavior that normally governs how people treat each other. Men who had been cultured and educated before the war found themselves behaving like animals, fighting over scraps, hoarding any food they could get, unable to think about anything except the burning need in their bellies. Disease killed as many prisoners as starvation did, and often the two worked together. A body weakened by hunger has no defenses against infection. A small cut becomes a gangrenous wound. A cough becomes pneumonia. A stomachache becomes dysentery that kills in days. Typhus swept through the camps repeatedly, spread by the lice that infested every prisoner's clothing and body. There was no way to get clean. The camps had no showers or baths. The prisoners wore the same clothes for months or years until the garments were more whole than fabric. The lice multiplied in the seams and folds, biting constantly, spreading disease with every bite. Men would spend their few moments of rest trying to pick the lice from their clothes and crush them between their fingernails, but it was a hopeless task because for every louse they killed, 100 more remained. Tuberculosis was another constant killer. The prisoners slept crowded together in unventilated barracks, breathing the same air, sharing the same diseases. Once tuberculosis took hold in a barracks, it would spread to nearly everyone inside. The disease ate away at the lungs, causing a cough that brought up blood, a fever that never quite went away, a weakness that made even breathing difficult. There was no treatment, no medicine, nothing to do but wait and see who would survive and who would die. Dysentery caused men to waste away even faster than starvation alone would have done. The disease caused such severe diarrhea that the body could not absorb any nutrients from the little food that was available. Men with dysentery would visit the latrine dozens of times a day until they were too weak to make the trip and simply soiled themselves where they lay. The disease spread through contaminated water and food, and in camps where sanitation was almost non-existent, it was impossible to control. The sick had nowhere to go and no one to care for them. There were camp hospitals, but these were hospitals in name only. They had no medicines, no equipment, no supplies. The hospital was simply a place where the very sickest prisoners were put so they would not spread their diseases to those who were still able to work. Being sent to the hospital was often a death sentence, because once you stopped working, your food ration was cut, and without food, recovery was impossible. The camp doctors, usually German prisoners who had been doctors before the war, did what they could with nothing. They comforted the dying, they tried to keep the sick warm, they shared what little medical knowledge they had. But mostly, they just watched men die one after another, day after day, until the doctors themselves became numb to death and stopped feeling anything at all. The German prisoners experienced not one Siberian winter, but many. The war had ended in May of 1945, but the Soviets did not release the prisoners immediately. Some were held for 5 years, others for 10 years. A few were not released until the mid-1950s, more than a decade after they had surrendered in Stalingrad. This meant enduring winter after winter in conditions that were barely survivable even once. Each winter brought new challenges and new deaths. The cold was so extreme that spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. Men lost fingers and toes and noses and ears to frostbite, the flesh turning black and falling off, leaving them disfigured for life. Heating in the barracks was minimal at best. There might be a small stove in the center of the building, but there was never enough fuel to keep it burning through the night. The prisoners would crowd as close to the stove as they could, fighting for the spots nearest the heat, while those farther away shivered in the darkness. They slept in their clothes, every layer they owned piled on their bodies, huddled together for warmth. In the morning, they would wake to find frost coating the inside of the barracks, their breath having frozen on the walls during the night. Going outside to work in the morning darkness was a test of will. The shock of the cold hitting their face felt like being slapped with a board. Their lungs burned when they breathed the frozen air. Their joints stiffened and their movements became slow and painful. Working outside in such conditions should have been impossible, but the guards forced them to do it anyway. They cut down trees in forests where the temperature was 40 below zero. They loaded and unloaded freight from trains while snow swirled around them in blinding storms. They dug ditches in ground that was frozen solid and had to be broken with picks before shovels could be used. The work itself was hard enough, but doing it while freezing and starving and sick pushed the prisoners beyond any reasonable limit of human endurance. Many simply could not do it. They would collapse in the snow and die where they fell, and the other prisoners would be ordered to carry the body back to camp after the workday ended. Each winter killed a new wave of prisoners, and those who survived one winter faced the knowledge that another was coming, and then another after that, with no end in sight. One of the cruelest aspects of the prisoners' experience was being cut off from their families and from any news of home. For the first several years of their captivity, the prisoners were not allowed to send or receive letters. They had no way to tell their families they were alive. Their families had no way to know what had happened to them. Many prisoners were officially listed as missing in action, and their families spent years not knowing whether their sons or husbands or fathers were dead or alive. This uncertainty was a special kind of torture for both the prisoners and their loved ones. The prisoners would lie awake at night wondering what was happening at home, whether their wives had remarried thinking them dead, whether their children even remembered them, whether their parents were still alive. When the Soviets finally did allow letters, the rules were strict. Letters could only be a few lines long. They were heavily censored. Anything that mentioned conditions in the camps was crossed out. Anything that could be considered criticism of the Soviet Union was crossed out. What remained were brief, sanitized messages that said almost nothing. Still, these letters were precious beyond measure. Receiving a letter from home could lift a man's spirits for weeks. Knowing that someone out there still remembered him, still cared about him, still waited for him, gave him a reason to keep fighting to survive. Many prisoners kept these letters until they literally fell apart from being read and reread hundreds of times. But letters could also bring devastating news. A man might learn that his wife had died during the war, that his children had been killed in a bombing raid, that his parents had passed away, that his home had been destroyed, that his entire family was gone and he had nothing and no one to return to. Such news could break a man completely. Some prisoners who received terrible news from home simply gave up and died within weeks, their will to live extinguished by the knowledge that everything they had been fighting for was already lost. Others found that the bad news made them even more determined to survive, if only to honor the memory of those they had lost. The letters from home were a lifeline to the world outside the camps, a reminder that another world existed beyond the barbed wire and the guards and the endless suffering. But they were also a reminder of everything the prisoners had lost and might never get back. As the late 1940s turned into the early 1950s, conditions in the camps began to improve slightly. The Soviets started providing a little more food. Medical care became marginally better. The death rate decreased, though it never stopped entirely. The improvement came partly because the Soviet Union itself was recovering from the war and had more resources available, and partly because international pressure was being applied to treat the prisoners better. The Red Cross and other organizations were demanding access to the camps. West Germany, which had been established as a new country in 1949, was negotiating for the return of its citizens. The Cold War was beginning, and the Soviets found it useful to show that they could be reasonable about the prisoner issue. The prisoners who had survived this long began to see small signs that maybe, just maybe, they might eventually go home. Some prisoners were released early, usually those who were too sick or too injured to work anymore. These men were loaded onto trains and sent back to Germany, where they arrived as living ghosts, barely recognizable to their families, physically and mentally scarred in ways that would never fully heal. Their return brought hope to those still in the camps, but also bitterness because the selections for release seemed arbitrary and unfair? Why was one man chosen to go home while another, who had suffered just as much, had to stay? There was no clear answer, and the uncertainty added to the psychological strain. Those who remained in the camps tried to make the best of their situation. They organized schools where educated prisoners taught languages or mathematics or history to others. They formed theater groups and put on plays using improvised costumes and sets. They created orchestras with instruments made from scrap materials. These activities helped pass the time and gave the prisoners something to think about besides their suffering. They also helped maintain a sense of humanity and culture in a place designed to strip away everything human. The men who participated in these activities often said later that these small moments of normalcy, these brief escapes into art and education and beauty, were what kept them sane when everything else was trying to drive them mad. The largest waves of releases came in the mid-1950s, particularly after Joseph Stalin died in 1953 and the new Soviet leadership decided to improve relations with the West. In 1955 and 1956, tens of thousands of German prisoners were finally sent home, some of them having been in captivity for 13 years or more. The journey home was almost as difficult to process emotionally as the captivity had been. These men had left Germany as young soldiers in their 20s and were returning as middle-aged men in their 30s and 40s, having missed the prime years of their lives. They had left behind a Nazi Germany at war and were returning to a divided Germany at peace, a country they barely recognized, a country that had moved on without them. The reunions with families were bittersweet. Wives who had waited faithfully for more than a decade embraced husbands they barely recognized. Children who had been toddlers when their fathers left now met strangers who claimed to be their parents. Some families had given up hope, and the returning prisoner found that his wife had remarried, or that his family had declared him legally dead and moved on with their lives. The returning prisoners were physically broken, many of them disabled from frostbite or disease or injuries that had never healed properly. They were psychologically damaged in ways that would take years or decades to address, suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but what they simply called nightmares and memories they could not escape. Germany itself had changed beyond recognition. The country had been divided into East and West. Cities had been rebuilt. The economy was recovering. People were trying to forget the war and build new lives. Many Germans did not want to hear about what the prisoners had suffered because it reminded them of the war they were trying to put behind them. The prisoners found themselves isolated, unable to talk about their experiences with people who had not lived through them, unable to explain what they had endured to people who could not or would not understand. Some prisoners banded together, forming associations and support groups where they could talk to others who had shared their experiences. These groups became a lifeline for men who felt like strangers in their own country, men who had survived hell only to find that the world they returned to had no place for them. Not all the prisoners returned. Of the nearly 100,000 German soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 ever made it back to Germany. The rest died in the death marches, in the collection camps, in the transports to Siberia, in the labor camps, from disease, from starvation, from cold, from exhaustion, from despair. Their bodies were buried in mass graves across the Soviet Union, often unmarked, often unrecorded, lost to history. Their families waited for years for news that never came, holding out hope long after hope was reasonable, finally accepting that their loved ones were gone, but never knowing exactly when or where or how they died. The exact death toll will never be known with certainty because the Soviets did not keep careful records, or if they did, those records were not made public. Estimates suggest that about 95% of the prisoners died in captivity, a death rate that is almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. These men did not die quickly or heroically in battle. They died slowly, miserably, in ways that robbed them of their dignity and their humanity. They died alone in frozen forests, on the floors of filthy boxcars, in crowded barracks surrounded by other dying men. They died knowing that no one would remember where they fell. that their families would never know what became of them, that they would simply disappear as if they had never existed. The question of whether these men deserved their fate is one that historians and moralists have debated ever since. On one hand, these were soldiers of an army that had invaded a foreign country, that had committed terrible atrocities, that had participated in a war of extermination that killed millions of innocent people. Many of these soldiers had been enthusiastic supporters of Hitler and the Nazi regime. They had believed in the cause they were fighting for. They bore some responsibility for the horrors that Germany had inflicted on Europe and particularly on the Soviet Union. On the other hand, many of these soldiers were ordinary men who had been drafted into service, who had not chosen the war, who were following orders because they had no choice. They were sons and brothers and fathers who had lives and families and futures that were destroyed. Whatever they had done or not done during the war, the suffering they endured in captivity was extreme and disproportionate, a level of cruelty that goes beyond any reasonable concept of justice or revenge. The fate of the German prisoners from Stalingrad became one of the defining stories of World War II and of the 20th century. It demonstrated what happens when ideology and hatred and the desire for revenge override basic human decency. It showed the depths of suffering that human beings can endure and the depths of cruelty that human beings can inflict. The story became a warning about the costs of war, not just the costs measured in battles won and lost, but the costs measured in human lives destroyed, in families torn apart, in suffering that echoes down through generations. In Germany, the returning prisoners and their stories contributed to a national reckoning with the past. The German people had to confront what their country had done during the war and what had been done to their soldiers as a consequence. The Stalingrad prisoners became symbols of German suffering, but also reminders of German guilt. The conversation about who bore responsibility for the war and its consequences continued for decades and in many ways continues still. In the Soviet Union and later in Russia, the treatment of the German prisoners was largely justified as righteous revenge for the German invasion and the millions of Soviet citizens who had died. The suffering of the prisoners was seen as deserved punishment for the crimes of Nazi Germany, and little sympathy was extended to them. The historical memory of Stalingrad focuses primarily on the battle itself, on the military turning point when the Soviet Union stopped the German advance and began the push that would eventually lead to Berlin. But the story of what happened after the battle, the story of the prisoners and their brutal fate, is equally important as a lesson about the human costs of war. These men experienced something that should never happen to any human being, regardless of what uniform they wear or what country they fight for. Their story is a reminder that war does not end when the shooting stops, that the consequences of conflict continue long after the treaties are signed, that the scars left by war can last for lifetimes and affect not just those who fight, but their families and their societies for generations to come. Those prisoners who did make it home eventually began to tell their stories, although many waited decades before they could bring themselves to talk about what they had experienced. Their testimonies, recorded in books and interviews and documentaries, provide heartbreaking details about life in captivity. They describe the constant cold that penetrated to their bones and never left. They describe the hunger that dominated every thought and every dream. They described watching their friends die one by one until they were surrounded only by strangers, and then watching those strangers die too. They described the degradation of being reduced to creatures who cared only about survival, who would do almost anything for an extra piece of bread, who lost the ability to feel compassion because compassion was a luxury they could not afford. But they also described moments of unexpected humanity. A Soviet guard who secretly shared his own ration with a starving prisoner. A camp doctor who risked punishment to steal medicine for the sick. Prisoners who sacrificed their own food to keep a weaker comrade alive. Small acts of kindness that shone like lights in the darkness, proving that even in the worst circumstances, some people remained human and decent and good. The survivors also described how the experience changed them forever. They could never quite shake the feeling that they were still in the camps, that the freedom they enjoyed was temporary, that at any moment they might be forced back into captivity. They hoarded food, unable to believe that there would always be enough to eat. They could not tolerate being cold, heating their homes to temperatures that others found uncomfortable. They woke up screaming from nightmares in which they were back in Siberia, back in the boxcars, back on the death marches. They struggled with guilt, wondering why they had survived when so many others had died, feeling that they did not deserve to live when better men had perished. This survivor's guilt haunted many of them for the rest of their lives, a burden they carried silently because they did not know how to talk about it or who would understand if they did. The families of the Stalingrad prisoners suffered their own kind of torment. For years they lived in uncertainty, not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. The official notification would only say that a soldier was missing in action, which could mean anything from captured to killed to deserted. Families clung to hope, believing that someday their son or husband or father would come walking through the door. They kept his room ready. They saved his possessions. They told stories about him to younger children who had never met him so that he would not be forgotten. As years passed with no word, hope began to fade, but many families could never quite let go of the possibility that somehow, somewhere, their loved one had survived and would return.